Sometimes the people we lose leave us gifts we never expected. Clara Whitlow stood at her grandfather's funeral, knowing she'd wasted years staying angry instead of trying to understand the old man who'd raised her. Now all she had left was a falling-down cottage in the Montana mountains and an orange cat named Rusty. Most folks in Pine Ridge figured the place wasn't worth much, but Clara needed somewhere to heal after losing everything in the city. That old cat seemed to know things about the house that Clara didn't. When Rusty kept scratching at the kitchen floor, Clara found something hidden underneath that changed everything. Gold coins from the 1890s worth $3 million today. But what happens when word gets out about buried treasure in a small town where everyone knows your business? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara had never imagined she'd be standing in a lawyer's office at 24, signing papers for property she'd never wanted to inherit. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Mr. Patterson, her grandfather's attorney, slid the final documents across his worn oak desk. Outside, the streets of Pine Ridge looked as tired as she felt. Pickup trucks parked at angles, weathered storefronts advertising hardware and feed, mountains rising like ancient guardians beyond the town's modest borders. "Your grandfather left specific instructions," Patterson said, adjusting his reading glasses. "The cottage, the land, and all contents go to you. He also left funds to cover the property taxes for the next 2 years. The lawyer's expression softened. "He talked about you often, Miss Whitlow. Regretted the distance between you two." Clara's throat tightened. She'd been working 60-hour weeks at a marketing firm in Denver when the call came. Grandfather was gone. Heart attack in his sleep, peaceful according to his neighbor. She'd driven the winding mountain roads with tears blurring her vision, arriving too late for any final words, any chance at reconciliation. The cottage sat 15 miles outside Pine Ridge, accessible only by a gravel road that twisted through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Clara's sedan bounced over potholes as she approached the property, her headlights catching glimpses of deer watching from the tree line. When she finally pulled into the overgrown driveway, her heart sank. The house looked like it was surrendering to the mountain. Cedar shingles had weathered to silver gray, some hanging loose or missing entirely. The wraparound porch sagged on one side, and several windows wore patches of cardboard where glass had once been. A massive stone chimney rose from the center of the structure, solid and defiant against the elements. But everything else spoke of decades of deferred maintenance. Clara sat in her car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. This was her inheritance, a falling-down cabin in the middle of nowhere, left by a man she'd barely spoken to in 5 years. She thought of her empty apartment back in Denver, cleaned out after the layoffs hit her company. She thought of her ex-fiancé David, who'd called their engagement off when her job disappeared, claiming he needed stability in a partner. Maybe they deserved each other, the broken cottage and the lost woman. The front door key hung exactly where Patterson had said it would, on a rusted nail behind a loose board on the porch. As Clara lifted it, she noticed something leaning against the door frame. A walking stick carved from mountain mahogany, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Her grandfather's hands had shaped every curve, every detail of the eagle head that formed the handle. She picked up the walking stick, feeling its familiar weight. Grandfather had always carried it on their rare walks together when she was small, before their relationship had grown cold and distant. Now it felt like a greeting from beyond, a reminder of the connection they'd once shared. The front door opened with a groan of protest, revealing rooms shrouded in dust and shadow. Clara found a light switch and was surprised when electricity flickered to life, casting warm, yellow pools throughout the main room. The interior was better preserved than the exterior suggested. Solid log construction with wide plank floors that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. A massive stone fireplace dominated the living area, its hearth clean and ready for use. Handmade furniture filled the space, oak chairs with leather cushions, a dining table scarred by decades of meals and conversations. bookshelves lined with volumes on geology, local history, and wildlife management. Everything spoke of a solitary life lived with careful attention to detail. In the kitchen, Clara discovered the cottage's most modern amenities: a propane refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, cast-iron stove that looked like it could outlast civilization, and hand-pumped well water that ran clear and cold. Mason jars lined the counters, some filled with preserved vegetables, others holding collections of interesting rocks and minerals. That's when she heard the meowing. The sound came from somewhere near the back door, insistent and demanding. Clara opened the door to find a large orange tabby cat sitting on the steps, green eyes fixed on her with unmistakable intelligence. The cat was well-fed and healthy, his coat thick and lustrous, despite showing signs of age around the muzzle. "You must be Rusty," Clara said, remembering Patterson's mention of her grandfather's companion. The cat studied her for a moment, then walked into the cottage as if he owned the place, which Clara supposed he did as much as anyone. Rusty made a circuit of the main rooms, pausing to sniff at Clara's bags before settling on a worn cushion near the fireplace. His purr filled the quiet cottage like distant thunder. Clara spent the evening exploring room by room, discovering her grandfather's life in accumulated details. The bedroom held a cedar chest filled with family photographs, images of Clara's grandmother, long-dead relatives, and pictures of Clara herself as a child. She found herself staring at a photo from her 8th birthday, grandfather's arm around her shoulders as she blew out candles on a homemade cake. When had things changed between them? She remembered her teenage years, the arguments about her choices, her friends, her plans for college. Grandfather had wanted her to stay close, to appreciate the mountains and the simple life he'd built. She'd wanted escape, adventure, the excitement of city life. Their conversations had grown shorter, visits less frequent, until eventually they'd communicated, only through birthday cards and brief phone calls on holidays. The cottage's second bedroom had been converted into an office, rough-hewn desk covered with geological surveys, mining maps, and correspondence with various government agencies. Clara recognized her grandfather's careful handwriting on notebooks, filled with observations about weather, wildlife sightings, and what appeared to be detailed records of his daily activities. By the time Clara made up the bed in the main bedroom, Rusty had claimed his spot at the foot of the mattress. She didn't have the heart to move him, and truthfully, his presence was comforting in the unfamiliar space. As she settled under her grandmother's quilt, she could hear the night sounds of the mountains, wind through pine boughs, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. For the first time in months, Clara felt something approaching peace. The cottage might be falling apart, but it was shelter. Rusty might be an unexpected responsibility, but he was companionship. And somewhere in this place that her grandfather had chosen to call home, maybe she could find the healing she desperately needed. The next morning brought crystalline mountain air and the smell of pine sap warming in the sun. Clara made coffee on the wood stove, using supplies her grandfather had left behind, and carried her mug onto the front porch. The view stretched across a valley thick with aspen and evergreen, mountains rising in purple layers toward the horizon. She could see why her grandfather had chosen this place, why he'd been content to live so far from the noise and rush of modern life. Rusty appeared beside her, sitting with dignity on the porch railing as he surveyed his domain. The cat seemed to have accepted her presence, but Clara sensed she was still being evaluated. Every move she made was observed with those intelligent green eyes, as if Rusty was determining whether she was worthy of his grandfather's trust. As Clara sipped her coffee, she noticed things she'd missed in yesterday's dim light. The cottage's foundation looked solid, despite the exterior's weathered appearance. The roof, while needing attention, didn't show signs of major leaks. With work and investment, the place could be restored to something approaching its original strength and beauty. More importantly, Clara realized she had nowhere else to go. Her savings would last a few more months, but not long enough to start over in a city. Here, at least, she had shelter and time to figure out her next move. The cottage might be rustic, But the property taxes were paid, the utilities functional, and she had Rusty for company. For the first time since receiving the inheritance, Clara allowed herself to imagine staying, not permanently perhaps, but long enough to repair the worst of the cottage's problems, to understand what her grandfather had loved about this place, and maybe to heal the wounds that losing her job and her relationship had left behind. Rusty jumped down from the railing and padded toward the door, pausing to look back at Clara with what seemed like approval. Maybe she'd passed the first test. Maybe in this place, her grandfather had called home. She could learn to be at peace with the choices that had brought her here. Clara had been living in the cottage for 3 weeks when Rusty's behavior began to change. The orange tabby had established routines: morning patrol of the property, afternoon naps in sunny patches, evening supervision of Clara's dinner preparations. But now he spent increasing amounts of time in the kitchen, focused on a section of floor near the old cast-iron stove. At first, Clara assumed he was hunting mice. The cottage was old, and rural properties always harbored rodents. She'd even been grateful for Rusty's pest control services. But this was different. The cat would sit for hours staring at the same spot, occasionally pawing at the wide pine planks with determined precision. "What is it, boy?" Clara asked one morning, crouching beside him as he scratched persistently at a particular board. "You hear something down there?" Rusty looked up at her with those intelligent green eyes, meowed once with unmistakable urgency, then returned to his scratching. Clara examined the floor more closely. The plank he was targeting looked different from the others, slightly discolored, as if it had been removed and replaced at some point. Running her fingers along its edges, she could feel that it sat just slightly higher than its neighbors. The scratching became more insistent over the following days. Rusty would wake Clara before dawn, leading her to the kitchen and positioning himself beside the suspicious board. His behavior grew so focused that Clara began to wonder if something was actually wrong with the floor itself, perhaps a leak or structural damage that the cat could sense, but she couldn't. See, on a Thursday morning, armed with determination and a pry bar she'd found in her grandfather's tool collection, Clara decided to investigate. If there was a problem underneath the kitchen floor, she needed to know about it before it became a bigger issue. The first board came up easier than expected, revealing a gap that had clearly been accessed before. Clara's pulse quickened as she pried up the adjacent planks, creating an opening large enough to see into the space beneath. Rusty sat beside the hole, tail twitching with excitement, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Clara aimed her flashlight into the darkness and gasped. Nestled in the space between floor joists was a leather satchel, darkened with age, but preserved by the dry conditions beneath the cottage. Next to it lay a rectangular object wrapped in oiled canvas. Clara's hands shook slightly as she lifted both items from their hiding place, Rusty purring with satisfaction at her discovery. The satchel contained a collection of items that made Clara's breath catch. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age but still readable. A collection of black and white photographs showing men with mining equipment posed beside what appeared to be excavation sites. Several hand-drawn maps sketched on surveyor's paper, marked with symbols and notations Clara didn't immediately recognize. But it was the journal that captured her attention completely. The first page bore her grandfather's name in young, careful handwriting, property of William Whitlow. 1962. The entries began matter-of-factly, recording daily activities and observations about the property. But as Clara read deeper, she realized she was looking at something far more significant. Found. The old shaft markers today, read one entry dated July 15th, 1962. Grandfather's stories were true after all. The cache location matches his description exactly. Clara's heart pounded. Cache? What kind of cache? She flipped through pages, chronicling what appeared to be a systematic search of the property. Her grandfather had documented locations of old mine shafts, areas where the earth showed signs of previous excavation, and geological features that suggested mineral deposits. The maps correlated with journal entries, creating a detailed record of exploration and discovery. One entry, dated August 3rd, 1962, made Clara sit down hard on the kitchen floor, located the main cache today. Grandfather was right. It's all there, just where the family stories said it would be. More than I imagined. More than anyone imagined. The assay samples confirm what I hoped. This changes everything, but also complicates everything. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. The wrapped canvas package revealed itself to be a collection of photographs and documents. Clara spread them carefully on the kitchen table, Rusty watching with apparent interest as she examined each item. Several photographs showed men in late 19th century clothing posed beside mining equipment. Others depicted excavation sites with wooden frameworks and metal rails, suggesting serious mining operations. But one photograph stopped Clara cold. It showed 5 men standing beside what appeared to be a mine entrance, their faces serious in the formal manner of old portraits. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Whitlow Mine, 1892, last day of operation." At the bottom of the image, an X had been marked in pencil beside one of the mine structures. Clara compared the marked photograph to her grandfather's hand-drawn maps. The location of the X corresponded exactly to an area he'd labeled primary site on his detailed property survey. Whatever her grandfather had been looking for, he'd found it in the exact spot indicated by this century-old photograph. The implications began to sink in as Clara read more journal entries. Her family had operated a mine on this property in the 1890s. Her grandfather had discovered something related to that mining operation, something significant enough to hide beneath the cottage floor for decades. The word cache appeared repeatedly in his notes, along with references to samples and assays that suggested valuable mineral deposits. Rusty rubbed against Clara's leg, purring loudly as if celebrating their shared discovery. Clara reached down to scratch behind his ears, marveling at how the cat had known exactly where to look. Had her grandfather trained him to guard this secret? Did Rusty understand the significance of what they'd found? The final entries in the journal were more recent, written in the shaky handwriting of her grandfather's later years. Clara graduates from college next month. Haven't heard from her in months. Don't know if she'll ever want to know about this place, about what's here. Maybe it's better if some things stay hidden. The cache has been safe for over a century. It can wait longer if it has to. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Even as their relationship had grown distant, her grandfather had been thinking about her, wondering if she'd ever want to know the secrets of the family property. Now, sitting on the kitchen floor with his hidden journal in her hands, she realized how little she'd understood about the man who'd raised her or the land he'd chosen to call home. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes and casting warm light across the scattered photographs and maps. Clara looked at Rusty, who seemed to be waiting for her next move. "What do you think, boy?" she asked softly. "Should we find out what grandfather was hiding?" Rusty meowed once, definitive and clear, then padded toward the back door. Clara followed, clutching the journal and the marked photograph. Whatever her grandfather had discovered on this property, whatever secret he'd kept hidden beneath the cottage floor, she was about to uncover it. As she stepped onto the back porch, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a mixture of excitement and trepidation that reminded her of childhood adventures. For the first time since arriving at the cottage, she felt truly connected to this place and to the grandfather she'd lost. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to discover the truth he'd preserved for her to find. The Pine Ridge Public Library occupied a stone building that had once served as the town's bank, its thick walls and barred windows speaking to an era when frontier towns needed to protect their assets from both natural disasters and human threats. Clara pushed through the heavy oak doors, the brass compass from her grandfather's cache weighing in her jacket pocket like a secret burning to be shared. Behind the circulation desk sat a woman who could have been anywhere from 60 to 80, her silver hair pinned in an elegant twist, her eyes bright with intelligence behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked up from a stack of returned books as Clara approached. "You must be William's granddaughter," the woman said, before Clara could introduce herself. "I'm Martha Hendricks. Your grandfather and I were friends for many years. I'm so sorry for your loss." Clara felt a familiar pang at the mention of their friendship, another relationship her grandfather had maintained while theirs had withered. "Thank you. I'm Clara Whitlow. I was hoping you might have some information about local history, particularly mining operations from the 1890s. Martha's eyebrows rose with interest. "Mining history is one of my favorite subjects. Pine Ridge was built on gold and silver from these mountains. Are you researching something specific?" Clara hesitated, then pulled out one of the photographs she'd found beneath the cottage floor. "I discovered some old family documents. This picture shows something called the Whitlow Mine from 1892. I was hoping to learn more about my family's involvement in the mining operations around here." Martha studied the photograph with growing excitement, her fingers tracing the edges as if she were handling a precious artifact. "Oh my, this is extraordinary. I knew your great-great-grandfather operated a claim up on the mountain, but I've never seen photographic evidence. The Whitlow operation was legendary in these parts. Legendary how?" Clara settled into a chair beside the desk, sensing Martha had stories worth hearing. "Your ancestor Samuel Whitlow was what they called a hard rock miner, specialized in extracting gold from quartz veins rather than placer mining in streams. He was one of the most successful operators in the territory, but his mine closed suddenly in 1892. The story passed down through the generations was that he'd found something significant just before shutting down operations." Clara's pulse quickened. "What kind of significant?" Martha rose and gestured for Clara to follow her to a section of the library dedicated to local history. She pulled several leather-bound volumes from the shelves, opening them to reveal newspaper clippings, handwritten accounts, and more photographs of mining operations. Throughout the valley, the territorial newspapers from that era reported that Samuel Whitlow had struck what they called the mother lode, a vein of gold-bearing quartz unlike anything previously found in these mountains. But then, without explanation, he sealed the mine and never reopened it. Some said he'd extracted enough wealth to last several lifetimes and simply chose to quit while ahead. Clara examined the newspaper clippings Martha pointed out. Headlines from 1892 proclaimed Whitlow strike richest in territory and mysterious closure of productive mine. The articles described Samuel Whitlow as a man of few words who kept his business private, even by the standards of independent miners. What happened to him? Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Died the following winter. Pneumonia, according to the death certificate I helped research for a family genealogy project years ago. He was survived by a son, your great-grandfather, who never reopened the mine. The family seemed to want nothing to do with mining after Samuel's death. Martha pulled out a map of the region from the 1890s, and pointing to an area that Clara recognized from her grandfather's more recent surveys. The Whitlow claim was located here, about 2 miles up the mountain from your grandfather's cottage. The terrain is rough, but the old mining roads should still be passable on foot. As Clara studied the historical map, Martha continued sharing family lore. Your grandfather William used to come in here regularly, researching the same topics you're asking about today. He was fascinated by Samuel's story, spent years trying to piece together what really happened in 1892. Did he ever tell you what he found? Martha's expression grew thoughtful. William was a private man, much like his ancestor. But I got the sense over the years that he'd discovered more than he let on. There were times when he'd come in excited about some new piece of evidence, then suddenly become secretive when I asked for details. Clara felt the weight of the compass in her pocket, remembering her grandfather's journal entries about finding the cache and conducting assays. Had he spent decades researching the family mining history, eventually discovering whatever Samuel Whitlow had hidden before his death? Mrs. Hendricks, hypothetically speaking, if someone did find something valuable on old mining property, what would be the legal situation? Would it belong to the current property owner? Martha's eyes sharpened with interest. That would depend on several factors. The nature of what was found, whether the original mining claims were properly filed, and what the current property deed specified about mineral rights. Why do you ask? Before Clara could answer, the library's front door chimed, and both women looked up to see a man in his 40s entering. He had the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, with calloused hands and sun-lined eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. "Clara Whitlow?" he asked, approaching their table. "I'm Jake Morrison. I've been doing some repair work around town, and I heard you might be looking to fix up your grandfather's place." Clara felt immediately cautious. Pine Ridge was small, but word traveled fast if strangers were asking questions about local history and mining claims. "I might be. How did you hear about that?" Jake's smile seemed genuine enough. "Small town. Everyone knows everyone's business. Your grandfather mentioned a few times over the years that he hoped his granddaughter would eventually take an interest in the property. I did some work for him, helped maintain the cottage when his arthritis made it difficult." Martha nodded approvingly. "Jake's done good work for several people in town. Your grandfather trusted him. I was wondering if you'd like me to take a look at what needs doing," Jake continued. "The cottage has good bones, but mountain weather can be hard on a building. I could give you an honest assessment of what repairs are most urgent." Clara found herself torn between wariness and practical need. The cottage did need work, and if her grandfather had trusted this man, perhaps she should consider his offer. But something about the timing of Jake's appearance, just as she was researching family mining history, felt too convenient. "I appreciate the offer," Clara said carefully. "Let me think about it and get back to you." Jake nodded and handed her a business card. "No pressure. Take your time. Just wanted you to know the option was available." He tipped his hat to Martha and left as abruptly as he'd arrived. "Interesting timing," Martha murmured once Jake was gone. "My thoughts exactly," Clara replied, studying the business card. It listed Jake Morrison as specializing in historical property restoration, with a phone number but no address. Martha helped Clara make copies of the relevant historical documents and maps, creating a research file she could take back to the cottage. As Clara prepared to leave, the older woman touched her arm gently. "Your grandfather was a good man who loved this valley and its history. Whatever you're really researching, I hope you'll be careful. Sometimes the past holds secrets people prefer to keep buried." Driving back to the cottage, Clara reflected on Martha's warning and Jake Morrison's convenient offer of help. The brass compass seemed to pulse with weight in her pocket, pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward whatever her great-great-grandfather had hidden in the mountains more than a century ago. Clara spent the evening after her library visit systematically searching her grandfather's bedroom, motivated by Martha's revelation that he'd spent years researching family mining history. If he'd found additional evidence about Samuel Whitlow's mysterious mine closure, she reasoned, he would have kept it somewhere secure but accessible. Rusty supervised from his perch on the windowsill, occasionally offering soft chirps of encouragement when Clara's search seemed to be heading in the right direction. The cat had proven surprisingly helpful in guiding her discoveries, first to the loose floorboards in the kitchen, and now apparently willing to assist in further treasure hunting. The bedroom's cedar chest yielded a treasure trove of family documents Clara hadn't examined closely during her first exploration. Beneath the photographs and letters lay a manila envelope marked Family Research Private in her grandfather's careful handwriting. Inside, Clara found materials that made her heart race with excitement. The envelope contained additional photographs from the Whitlow mine, including several images Clara hadn't seen before. One showed the interior of what appeared to be a mining tunnel, with wooden support beams and tracks for ore cars. Another depicted a group of men examining what looked like chunks of gold-bearing quartz, their faces serious with concentration, but the photograph that made Clara catch her breath showed 5 men posed in front of a mine entrance, identical to the image she'd found beneath the floorboards, except this version was clearer, and someone had written detailed information on the back in faded ink. Final day of operation. October 15th, 1892. Samuel Whitlow. Mine foreman Davis. Workers Jackson, Murphy, and Chen. Location: primary shaft, Whitlow claim. Note: cache secured at coordinates marked below. At the bottom of the photograph, beneath the group of miners, someone had drawn a precise map with measurements and compass bearings. Clara compared it to her grandfather's modern survey of the property. The coordinates corresponded exactly to an area he'd labeled primary site. The envelope also contained official documents that filled in missing pieces of the historical puzzle. An assay report dated October 1892 showed that ore samples from the Whitlow mine contained gold concentrations far exceeding typical finds in the region. A letter from the Territorial Mining Office confirmed that Samuel Whitlow had filed claims covering nearly 400 acres of mineral rights in the mountains above Pine Ridge. Most intriguingly, Clara found a modern geological survey her grandfather had commissioned in 1985. The report confirmed the presence of gold-bearing quartz veins throughout the claimed area and noted that previous excavation had been selective and strategic, suggesting the original miners had known exactly where to focus their efforts. As Clara studied these documents, she began to understand the scope of what her great-great-grandfather had accomplished. Samuel Whitlow hadn't been a typical prospector hoping to strike it lucky. He'd been a methodical businessman who'd identified the richest deposits in the region and extracted them efficiently. The question remained, where had he hidden what he'd found? The next morning brought Jake Morrison to Clara's door, toolbox in hand, and a friendly smile on his weathered face. Clara had spent much of the night debating whether to trust him, finally deciding that maintaining the cottage was a practical necessity regardless of her other discoveries. "Morning, Clara," Jake said, tipping his hat. "Thought I'd start by checking the foundation and structural elements, if that's all right with you. Old mountain cabins can develop problems that aren't visible from the surface." Clara invited him in, watching carefully as Jake examined the cottage's main support beams and stone foundation. His assessment seemed professional and thorough. He noted areas where chinking needed renewal, identified a few places where roof repairs would prevent future water damage, and praised the quality of the original construction. "Your great-great-grandfather built this place to last," Jake observed, running his hands along a massive log beam. "This is old-growth timber that's gotten harder and stronger with age. With proper maintenance, this cottage could stand for another century. You know about Samuel Whitlow?" Clara asked, testing how much Jake knew about family history. Jake paused in his examination of a window frame. "Everyone in the valley knows the Whitlow story. Samuel was legendary. Successful miner who walked away from a profitable operation and built this cottage as his retirement home. Folks around here have always wondered what made him quit when he was ahead." Clara felt a chill of caution. Jake's knowledge seemed detailed for casual local folklore. "What do you think made him quit?" "Smart business sense, probably," Jake replied, but Clara noticed he was paying close attention to her reaction. Mining's dangerous work, and he'd already made more than most folks see in a lifetime. Maybe he decided to enjoy what he'd earned instead of risking it for more. As Jake continued his inspection, moving from room to room with practiced efficiency, Clara found herself studying him more carefully. His hands showed the calluses and scars of genuine construction work, and his assessment of the cottage's condition seemed knowledgeable and honest. But there was something about his questions, casual inquiries about family documents, offhand comments about the property's history, that felt calculated rather than conversational. When Jake examined the kitchen, he paused at the area where Clara had discovered the hidden floorboards. The planks had been replaced, but careful observation would reveal they'd been disturbed recently. "Looks like you've had some floor work done," Jake commented. Kneeling to examine the boards more closely, "I found some loose planks and fixed them," Clara replied. Keeping her voice neutral, Jake nodded, but seemed to file the information away for future consideration. "Old cottages always have little maintenance issues like that. Good thing you caught it early. After Jake finished his inspection and provided Clara with a detailed estimate for necessary repairs, she walked him to his truck. As he loaded his tools, he made what seemed like a casual observation. "You know, your grandfather mentioned over the years that this property might have more historical significance than most people realize. Ever find anything interesting in his papers or belongings?" Clara felt her pulse quicken, but managed to keep her expression calm. "Just the usual family photographs and documents. Nothing that would interest anyone outside the family." Jake nodded, but Clara caught him glancing back toward the cottage with what looked like professional assessment rather than casual interest. After he drove away, she stood in the driveway for several minutes, watching his dust trail disappear down the mountain road. Rusty appeared beside her, rubbing against her legs with obvious agitation. The cat's behavior around Jake had been noticeably different from his usual friendliness toward visitors. More wary, almost protective. "You didn't like him either, did you?" Clara murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Rusty's ears. Something about his questions felt off. Back inside the cottage, Clara spread her grandfather's maps and the historical photographs across the kitchen table. If Jake Morrison was more than a helpful handyman, if his interest in the property extended beyond repair work, she needed to understand exactly what Samuel Whitlow had hidden. Before anyone else came looking for it, the compass from her grandfather's cache pointed steadily toward the coordinates marked on the 1892 photograph, coordinates that led to a specific location in the mountains above the cottage. Whatever her great-great-grandfather had secured at that site had waited more than 130 years for discovery. Clara looked at Rusty, who had positioned himself near the back door as if waiting for their next adventure. "What do you say, boy? Ready to find out what all the fuss is about?" Clara began her systematic search of the property the next morning, armed with her grandfather's detailed maps, the compass that had been hidden with the family documents, and Rusty as her willing companion. The cat seemed to understand they were on a mission, staying close as they hiked up the mountain trails that connected the cottage to the historical mining sites. The first location marked on Samuel Whitlow's 1892 map proved to be a collapsed mine shaft, partially filled with debris and decades of accumulated vegetation. Clara could see evidence of the original wooden framework, now weathered grey and partially rotted, but nothing that suggested valuable materials had been left behind. The site felt abandoned in a way that spoke of thoroughness. Whatever had been extracted here was long gone. As they explored the mountainside, Clara discovered she wasn't the first person to search these locations recently. Footprints in soft earth, disturbed vegetation, and small excavations suggested that others had been exploring the same areas her grandfather had mapped. The realization made her uneasy. If people were already looking for whatever Samuel Whitlow had hidden, her own search might have attracted unwanted attention. "Looks like we're not alone in this treasure hunt," Clara murmured to Rusty, who seemed to share her concern. The cat's ears were constantly alert, swiveling towards sounds in the forest that Clara couldn't identify. It was while examining the third marked location that Clara encountered her first human competition. She'd been studying what appeared to be the remnants of a mining camp, flat areas where buildings had once stood, rusted pieces of equipment, and a stone foundation that might have supported mining machinery. When she heard voices approaching through the trees, Clara quickly gathered her maps and called Rusty to her side, positioning herself behind a large boulder that would provide concealment while allowing her to observe whoever was coming. Through the pine branches, she saw two men hiking toward the mining site, carrying metal detectors and excavation tools. The Brennan family claimed this area was part of their ancestors' original homestead, one man was saying. "If there's anything valuable still hidden up here, we've got as much right to it as anyone." Clara recognized the name Brennan from her research at the library. They'd been one of the founding families of Pine Ridge, with property adjacent to the Whitlow holdings. The men appeared to be conducting their own systematic search, moving methodically through the area with their metal detectors. As Clara watched, the older of the two men, a weathered individual in his 60s with the bearing of someone accustomed to outdoor work, directed his companion to focus their metal detector sweeps on areas that corresponded exactly to locations marked on Clara's grandfather's maps. Tom Brennan knows these mountains better than anyone, the younger man said, adjusting his equipment. If he says there's something worth finding up here, I believe him. Clara realized she was observing Tom Brennan himself, the current patriarch of the family that had been neighbors to the Whitlows for generations. His knowledge of the search location suggested the Brennan family had their own historical information about Samuel Whitlow's mining operations, information that might complement or contradict what Clara had discovered in her grandfather's hidden documents. The two men spent nearly an hour methodically searching the mining site, their metal detectors beeping occasionally as they located pieces of old equipment buried beneath decades of forest debris. Clara remained hidden, watching their techniques and noting the areas that seemed to generate the most interest. When they finally moved on to another location, she waited several minutes before emerging from concealment. Rusty had remained perfectly still during the observation period, as if he understood the need for stealth. Now he padded beside Clara as she examined the areas the Brennan team had searched most thoroughly. Whatever they were looking for, they seemed as systematic and well-informed as Clara's own efforts. That evening, Clara drove into Pine Ridge to gather supplies and, she hoped, learn more about Tom Brennan and his family's connection to the historical mining operations. The town's general store served as an informal information center where local residents gathered to share news and gossip. Tom Brennan, the store owner, an elderly man named Pete, nodded knowingly when Clara asked about him. Tom's family has been in this valley almost as long as yours. His great-grandfather worked with Samuel Whitlow back in the mining days, some kind of business partnership. According to the old stories, this was new information that Clara hadn't found in her grandfather's research. What kind of partnership? Details get fuzzy over the generations, Pete continued, but the way Tom tells it, his ancestor provided equipment and labor for the Whitlow mining operation. When Samuel shut down the mine in 1892, there was some kind of dispute about compensation. The Brennans always claimed they were owed money that was never paid. Clara felt a chill of understanding. If the Brennan family believed they had legitimate claims to whatever Samuel Whitlow had extracted from his mines, her discovery of the hidden cache could become significantly more complicated. She was no longer just searching for family treasure. She might be walking into a dispute that had been simmering for over a century. Tom's a good man, though, Pete added. Fair in his business dealings, helpful to his neighbors. If there's truth to the old family claims, he'd handle it honorably. Clara left the store with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense that she needed to accelerate her search efforts. If multiple parties were actively looking for Samuel Whitlow's hidden cache, whoever found it first might have significant advantages in any eventual legal disputes. The next morning brought Clara back to the mountains with renewed urgency. She'd studied her grandfather's maps late into the night, cross-referencing them with the historical photographs and identifying the most promising search locations. The brass surveyor's transit tool she'd found among her grandfather's belongings suggested he'd been conducting precise measurements rather than random exploration. Clara located the transit tool in her grandfather's workshop, a beautiful brass instrument that had been carefully maintained despite its obvious age. When she set it up according to the instructions in Samuel Whitlow's technical notes, she realized it was designed to establish sightlines between specific geographical features, mountain peaks, distinctive rock formations, and other permanent landmarks that wouldn't change over the decades, using the transit tool as Samuel Whitlow had intended. Clara began to understand the sophisticated system he'd created for locating and marking significant sites. The instrument allowed her to establish precise compass bearings and distances, creating a grid system that covered the entire mountain claim. It was while following one of these measured sightlines that Clara made her most significant discovery yet. hidden behind a cluster of large boulders, camouflaged by more than a century of natural vegetation growth. She found the entrance to what appeared to be a carefully concealed storage site. Unlike the collapsed mine shaft she'd explored earlier, this location showed evidence of deliberate preservation efforts. The entrance was protected by a stone overhang that had kept it dry, and the opening itself had been carefully sealed with fitted stones that could be removed without damage to the surrounding structure. Rusty became visibly excited as they approached the site, his tail twitching with anticipation and his purr growing louder. The cat seemed to recognize something familiar about this location, as if he'd been here before with Clara's grandfather. Clara examined the sealed entrance carefully, noting the precision with which the stones had been fitted and the care someone had taken to make the site appear natural and undisturbed. This wasn't a hastily abandoned mining operation. It was a deliberately created cache designed to preserve valuable materials for future recovery. As she photographed the site and recorded its exact coordinates, Clara realized she was looking at the culmination of Samuel Whitlow's mining career. Whatever he'd extracted from his claims, whatever had made him wealthy enough to retire at the height of his success, was likely hidden behind these carefully placed stones. But Clara also realized she was facing a decision that would define not just her immediate future, but her relationship with the community that had been her grandfather's home for decades. Opening this cache would change everything for her, for the Brennan family, and for anyone else who might have legitimate claims to Samuel Whitlow's legacy. Rusty rubbed against her legs, purring encouragement as if he understood the magnitude of the moment. Clara looked at the sealed entrance, then back toward the valley where Pine Ridge nestled among the mountains, and realized that some discoveries carried responsibilities she hadn't anticipated when her treasure hunt began. Clara returned to the cottage that evening with her mind spinning from the discovery of the sealed cache, but she wasn't prepared for what Rusty revealed next. As she prepared his dinner, the orange tabby began exhibiting behavior she'd never seen before, pawing insistently at his collar, rolling on the kitchen floor, and making urgent vocalizations that clearly meant he wanted her attention. "What's wrong, boy?" Clara knelt beside him, concerned that the day's hiking might have caused some injury or discomfort. But as she examined Rusty more closely, she realized he was deliberately trying to show her something about his collar. The leather collar was worn and weathered, obviously handmade, with a simple brass nameplate that read, "Rusty, property of William Whitlow." Clara had noticed it when she first met the cat, but hadn't examined it closely. Now, as Rusty continued his urgent behavior, she looked more carefully at the collar's construction. Hidden beneath the nameplate, accessible only by removing a small brass screw, was a tiny compartment Clara had never noticed. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from moisture, was a small brass key, unlike anything she'd seen in her grandfather's belongings. Clara's hands trembled as she examined the key. It was ornate, with decorative engraving and a distinctive shape that suggested it opened something more significant than a typical door or chest. On one side, someone had etched the initials SW, along with the year 1892. "Oh, Rusty," Clara whispered, understanding flooding over her. "Grandfather trusted you with more than I realized, didn't he?" The cat purred with obvious satisfaction, rubbing against Clara's legs as if relieved to finally share his secret. Clara realized that her grandfather had trained Rusty not just to guard the cottage, but to reveal crucial information only when Clara had proven herself ready to handle the responsibility. The next morning, Clara drove to the Pine Ridge Bank, the same institution where her grandfather had maintained his accounts for decades. If the key opened what she suspected it might, she needed to understand the full scope of what he'd preserved for her discovery. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman named Susan Torres, remembered William Whitlow fondly. "Your grandfather was one of our most reliable customers," she said, leading Clara to the safety deposit box area. "He maintained his box here for over 30 years, always paid his fees promptly, and never caused any trouble. Clara presented the ornate key along with the documentation, proving her inheritance of her grandfather's estate. Susan examined the key carefully, then checked it against the bank's records. "This opens one of our oldest safety deposit boxes," Susan said with obvious interest. "Your grandfather must have specifically arranged for you to have access, because his instructions were very clear about what should happen after his death." The safety deposit box was larger than Clara had expected, and when Susan unlocked it, using both Clara's inherited key and the bank's master key, Clara gasped at what was revealed inside. The box contained a treasure trove of documents that filled in every missing piece of the Samuel Whitlow puzzle. Detailed geological surveys, professional assay reports, and maps more precise than anything Clara had found at the cottage showed the full extent of her great-great-grandfather's mining discoveries. But it was the formal documentation that made Clara's breath catch. Legal papers establishing the exact boundaries of Samuel Whitlow's mineral claims. Assay reports confirming that gold extracted from his mines had been valued at astronomical sums for the 1890s. And most importantly, a detailed inventory of materials he'd secured for future recovery at various cache sites throughout his mountain property. According to the inventory, Samuel Whitlow had extracted and hidden gold ore worth nearly $3 million in contemporary values. The cache Clara had discovered on the mountainside was just one of several storage sites, but it was marked as containing primary materials of highest grade and concentration. The final document in the safety deposit box was a letter addressed to Clara in her grandfather's careful handwriting. "My dear granddaughter, if you're reading this, it means you've followed the clues I left and proven yourself worthy of the family legacy." Samuel Whitlow was more than a successful miner. He was a man who understood the responsibilities that come with wealth. The cache you've discovered represents not just gold, but choices about what kind of person you want to be. The Brennan family has legitimate claims to some of these materials. Their ancestor provided equipment and labor that made Samuel's success possible, and they were never fully compensated when the mining operation ended abruptly. Tom Brennan is a good man whose family has waited over a century for justice. Use the wealth wisely, but remember that true treasure isn't measured in gold. It's measured in the relationships you build and the community you choose to call home. Rusty will show you the way when you're ready. Your loving grandfather, William. Clara sat in the bank's private room for a long time, absorbing the implications of what she'd discovered. The treasure was real and valuable beyond her wildest dreams. But it came with moral obligations she hadn't anticipated. Obligations to neighbors, to community, and to a family history more complex than simple gold mining. Susan Torres knocked gently on the room's door. "Take all the time you need, dear. Your grandfather left specific instructions that you should never feel pressured to make quick decisions about whatever you found in his box." Clara gathered the documents carefully, realizing that her grandfather had orchestrated every aspect of her discovery, from Rusty's guidance to the timing of revelations, to ensure she understood both the treasure's value and its responsibilities. That evening, as Clara sat on the cottage porch with Rusty beside her, she studied the valley below and thought about the choice she was facing. The gold cache represented financial security beyond anything she'd ever imagined. But claiming it meant entering into disputes that had been brewing for generations. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that her grandfather's true gift wasn't the treasure itself. It was the opportunity to become part of a community that had shaped her family for more than a century. The cottage, the mountains, the neighbors like Tom Brennan and Martha Hendricks. These were the connections she'd been missing in her urban life. Rusty purred contentedly as Clara scratched behind his ears. The cat's trust and companionship, a reminder of the relationships that truly mattered. Whatever decision she made about Samuel Whitlow's hidden cache, she realized it needed to honor not just family legacy, but the community that had preserved that legacy through generations of neighbors helping neighbors. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Clara made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. She would open the cache, but not for the reasons she'd originally imagined. The treasure hunt had become something far more valuable, a journey toward understanding her place in a story much larger than her own immediate needs. Clara returned to the mountain cache the next morning with new understanding of what she might find, but she wasn't prepared for the discovery that would change everything about Samuel Whitlow's story. Working carefully to remove the fitted stones that sealed the entrance, she found herself looking into a natural cave that had been modified into a sophisticated storage facility. The cache was larger and more organized than she'd expected. Wooden crates lined the walls, each marked with dates and contents in Samuel Whitlow's careful handwriting. But it was what she found in the first crate that made Clara sit down hard on the cave's stone floor. Instead of raw gold ore or refined precious metals, the crate contained leather pouches filled with minted gold coins, hundreds of them, in denominations and designs Clara didn't recognize. More significantly, each pouch bore official seals and markings that suggested these weren't the products of private mining operations. Clara examined the coins more closely, her heart pounding as she realized what she was looking at. These were gold coins from the First National Bank of Helena, dated 1892, along with official documentation that made her blood run cold. The papers described the coins as recovered stolen property, from what the territorial authorities had called the largest bank robbery in Montana's history. Samuel Whitlow hadn't been just a successful miner, he'd been a law enforcement officer, a territorial deputy sheriff who'd recovered stolen gold from notorious outlaws. The cache wasn't hidden treasure from mining operations. It was evidence from a criminal investigation that had ended when Samuel was killed in the line of duty. Clara found Samuel's official badge wrapped in oiled cloth, along with detailed reports he'd written about tracking the gang responsible for the bank robbery. The final report, dated just days before his death, described recovering the full amount of stolen property, but noted his concern about additional parties with knowledge of the theft who remain at large. But the document that truly shocked Clara was Samuel Whitlow's final testament, written in his own hand and witnessed by territorial officials. In it, he acknowledged that he'd recovered far more than the original amount stolen from the Helena Bank. The thieves had been operating for months, accumulating wealth from multiple robberies across the territory. The recovered property exceeds the original theft by considerable margins, Samuel had written. Additional funds appear to represent proceeds from criminal enterprises extending beyond the Helena incident. Legal ownership must be determined by proper authorities, but immediate safety of materials requires secure storage pending investigation. Clara realized that Samuel Whitlow had died before completing his investigation, leaving behind recovered stolen property worth enormous sums but with no clear legal ownership. The territorial government had collapsed into statehood transitions. The bank had presumably collected insurance payments, and the criminal investigation had been forgotten as the frontier era ended. The moral implications hit Clara like a physical blow. This wasn't family treasure she'd inherited. This was stolen money that had never been returned to its rightful owners. Worse, some of those rightful owners might still have legal claims that had simply been lost in the bureaucratic chaos of territorial transitions. But as Clara continued exploring the cache, she found evidence that the situation was even more complex than she'd realized. Among Samuel's papers was correspondence with the Helena Bank's president, documenting the institution's collapse and dissolution shortly after the robbery. The bank had failed not because of the theft, but because of broader economic problems that had plagued frontier financial institutions. More significantly, Clara found documentation showing that Samuel had been working not just as a law enforcement officer, but as a private investigator, hired by various parties affected by the criminal gang's activities. The Brennan family's ancestor had been one of those parties. His business had been robbed by the same outlaws Samuel eventually tracked down. Clara discovered a letter from the elder Brennan to Samuel, written in 1892, Deputy Whitlow. Our family's mining equipment and accumulated gold dust was taken during the robbery of our mountain camp. We understand you've recovered materials from the criminal enterprise. We request return of our property or fair compensation as soon as your investigation concludes. Our business depends on recovery of these assets. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly fit together with devastating clarity. The Brennan family's claims about being owed money by Samuel Whitlow were true. They'd been victims of the same criminal gang, and Samuel had recovered their stolen property along with everything else. But he died before he could return what belonged to them. For more than 130 years, the Brennan family had believed Samuel Whitlow had cheated them out of fair compensation. In reality, he died trying to return what the criminals had taken from them. Clara sat in the cave for a long time, overwhelmed by the implications of what she'd discovered. The treasure was real and valuable, but it wasn't hers by any moral right. It belonged to the descendants of robbery victims, to failed banks, to a complex web of claims that had been lost to time and bureaucratic confusion. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. As Clara examined the final contents of the cache, she found evidence that someone else had known the truth about Samuel Whitlow's investigation, someone who'd been searching for the recovered stolen property for decades. Hidden among Samuel's papers was a more recent document, written in handwriting Clara recognized from insurance forms and business correspondence. Jake Morrison had been researching the Helena bank robbery for years, not as a handyman looking for work, but as an insurance investigator trying to locate assets that had never been accounted for in historical claim settlements. Jake's research notes, somehow placed in the cache recently, revealed that he represented the modern corporate successor to the insurance company that had covered the original bank robbery losses. The company had paid out claims in 1892 and now had legal rights to any recovered stolen property as subrogation for their losses. Subject property represents materials covered under policy. MT 1892047, Jake's notes read. Recovery value estimated at 2.8 million contemporary currency. Legal ownership remains with Pacific Mutual Insurance Company under territorial subrogation. Rights confirmed by Montana state courts. Clara realized that Jake Morrison's helpful offer to repair the cottage hadn't been coincidental. He'd been investigating her property because his insurance company had reason to believe Samuel Whitlow's cache still existed somewhere on the mountain. His questions about family documents and historical discoveries had been professional intelligence gathering, not casual curiosity. The treasure hunt that had begun as a search for family legacy had become something far more complicated, a legal maze involving insurance claims from the 1890s, territorial jurisdiction issues, and the rights of multiple parties who'd been affected by crimes committed more than a century ago. As Clara carefully documented everything she'd found and began the process of resealing the cache, she realized that her grandfather had known much more about the situation than his letters had revealed. He'd spent decades researching not just the location of Samuel's hidden materials, but the legal and moral questions surrounding their ownership. William Whitlow had left Clara more than a treasure hunt. He'd left her the responsibility of resolving a historical injustice that had affected multiple families for generations. The cache wasn't her inheritance. It was her opportunity to finally complete the investigation Samuel Whitlow had died trying to finish. Rusty waited patiently as Clara secured the cave entrance. The cat's presence a reminder that some loyalties transcended legal complications. Whatever Clara decided to do about Samuel Whitlow's recovered stolen property, she realized she wouldn't be making the decision alone. The community that had preserved her family's story for more than a century deserved to know the truth about what had really happened in 1892, and perhaps, Clara thought, as she hiked back toward the cottage with Rusty beside her, the truth itself was the most valuable treasure Samuel Whitlow had left behind. Clara spent a sleepless night at the cottage, wrestling with the moral complexity of what she'd discovered. The damaged sheriff's badge she'd found in the cache lay on her kitchen table beside her grandfather's research files, a tangible reminder of Samuel Whitlow's sacrifice and the justice that had remained incomplete for more than a century. By dawn, she'd made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She couldn't resolve the legal ownership questions alone, but she could do what Samuel Whitlow had died trying to accomplish. She could bring the truth to light and let all interested parties work together toward fair resolution. Clara's first call was to Martha Hendricks at the library. If anyone in Pine Ridge could help navigate the historical and legal complexities of the situation, it would be the woman who'd spent decades preserving the community's documentary heritage. Martha, I need to schedule a meeting with Tom Brennan and anyone else in town who might have family connections to the 1892 mining operations, Clara said. I've discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about Samuel Whitlow's story. Martha's voice sharpened with interest. What kind of discovery, dear? The kind that affects more than just my family, Clara replied carefully. The kind that's been waiting over 130 years for someone to make it right. Martha arranged for the meeting to be held at the library that evening, reaching out to Tom Brennan and several other longtime residents whose families had been part of Pine Ridge's early history. Clara spent the day preparing her presentation, organizing the documents and evidence she'd accumulated to tell the complete story of Samuel Whitlow's final investigation. As she worked, Rusty remained close beside her. The cat's presence a steady source of comfort as Clara prepared to make decisions that would affect not just her future, but the community her grandfather had called home. The sheriff's badge sat on the table where she could see it, a reminder that some responsibilities transcended personal gain. Jake Morrison arrived at the cottage unannounced that afternoon, his professional demeanor more obvious now that Clara understood his true purpose. She met him on the front porch, prepared for a conversation she'd been anticipating since discovering his research notes in the cache. Clara, we need to talk, Jake said. His friendly handyman persona dropped in favor of direct business communication. I think you've found what I've been looking for, and there are legal issues we need to discuss before you make any irreversible decisions. Clara gestured to the porch chairs, her grandfather's walking stick leaning against the railing like a symbol of the authority she'd inherited, along with the property. I know who you are, Jake. I know why you're really here. And I know about the insurance company's claims to whatever Samuel Whitlow recovered in 1892. Jake's surprise was genuine. How did you... He paused, reassessing Clara with new respect. You found the cache, didn't you? And you understand what it contains. I understand that it contains stolen property my great-great-grandfather died trying to return to its rightful owners, Clara replied. I also understand that your company has legal claims based on insurance payments made over 130 years ago. What I don't understand is why you thought you could investigate my property without being honest about your purposes. Jake had the grace to look embarrassed. Insurance fraud investigations often work better when people don't know they're being investigated. I wasn't sure you knew anything about the historical situation, and I didn't want to create unnecessary complications if the cache didn't actually exist. Well, it exists, Clara said, and tonight I'm meeting with Tom Brennan and other community members to discuss how we're going to handle the legal and moral issues surrounding its contents. You're welcome to attend and present your company's position. Jake studied Clara's face, clearly recognizing that she wasn't going to be intimidated or manipulated into quick decisions. You realize that my company has invested considerable resources in tracking down these assets. We have legitimate legal claims that date back to the original territorial period. And the Brennan family has legitimate moral claims to property that was stolen from them and never returned, Clara countered. And the people of Helena, whose bank was robbed, have claims to whatever wasn't returned to them. This isn't just about insurance company profit margins, Jake. This is about historical justice. That evening, the Pine Ridge Library became the site of the most significant community meeting in decades. Tom Brennan arrived with several family members, including his son David and his elderly Aunt Margaret, who at 92 was the oldest living connection to the events of 1892. Martha Hendricks had invited other longtime residents whose families had been affected by the criminal gang's activities. Jake Morrison sat in the back of the room, taking notes and occasionally consulting documents he'd brought from his company's research files. Clara noticed that despite the formal nature of his investigation, he seemed genuinely interested in learning the complete historical truth rather than simply advancing his employer's financial interests. Clara began her presentation by sharing the story of her treasure hunt, from Rusty's guidance to the loose floorboards, through the discovery of her grandfather's hidden research and the family documents that had led her to the mountain cache. The audience listened with growing fascination as she described the systematic investigation that had revealed the scope of Samuel Whitlow's law enforcement activities. But it was when Clara produced Samuel Whitlow's sheriff's badge and read from his final reports that the room fell silent with the weight of historical revelation. Samuel Whitlow wasn't just a successful miner who retired early, Clara explained. He was a territorial deputy sheriff who died in the line of duty, trying to return stolen property to families like the Brennans, who'd been robbed by a criminal gang operating throughout Montana Territory. Tom Brennan's reaction was immediate and emotional. "You mean he wasn't cheating us? All these years, all the family stories about being swindled by Samuel Whitlow, we had it wrong." Clara nodded, producing the letter Tom's ancestor had written to Samuel in 1892. "Your great-grandfather's mining equipment and gold dust was stolen by the same criminals. Samuel recovered everything, but he was killed before he could return what belonged to your family." Margaret Brennan, Tom's elderly aunt, began crying quietly as Clara read the historical documents aloud. "My grandfather told stories about the Whitlow betrayal until the day he died," she said through her tears. "He never got over believing he'd been cheated by a neighbor. If he'd known the truth, if any of us had known." The meeting continued for more than 2 hours as Clara presented each piece of evidence she'd discovered, building a complete picture of the 1892 investigation and its tragic end. Jake Morrison contributed information from his insurance company's research, filling in details about the broader criminal enterprise and the territorial jurisdiction problems that had prevented proper resolution of the recovered property. As the evening progressed, Clara watched the community members process the implications of what they'd learned. Anger at historical misunderstandings gave way to recognition that Samuel Whitlow had been a hero whose sacrifice had been misrepresented for more than a century. But it was Tom Brennan who articulated the question everyone was thinking. So what happens now? The cache exists, it's valuable, and there are multiple parties who might have legitimate claims to its contents. How do we resolve this fairly? Clara looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become her community. Martha, with her decades of historical knowledge. Tom and his family, carrying the weight of generational grievance. Jake representing corporate interests, but also genuine historical curiosity. And other residents whose families had been shaped by the same frontier struggles. "I think," Clara said slowly, "we need to do what Samuel Whitlow would have done if he'd lived to complete his investigation. We need to work together to determine fair distribution of the recovered property based on documented losses and legitimate claims." She paused, touching the sheriff's badge that lay on the table before her. "But first, we need to make sure everyone understands that this isn't just about money. This is about healing wounds that have divided this community for over 130 years, and about honoring the sacrifice of a man who died trying to make things right." The room fell quiet, as everyone absorbed the magnitude of what Clara was proposing. She wasn't just suggesting they divide up a treasure. She was asking them to work together to complete a quest for justice that had begun before any of them were born. The week following Clara's revelation transformed Pine Ridge in ways the small mountain community hadn't experienced in generations. Word of the discovered cache and its historical significance spread through the valley's network of family connections, bringing together people who'd carried grudges and misunderstandings. For decades, Clara found herself at the center of negotiations that required both diplomatic skill and moral courage she wasn't sure she possessed. But Martha Hendricks proved to be an invaluable ally, her decades of historical research providing the documentary foundation needed to establish legitimate claims and resolve conflicting family narratives. The key to understanding this situation, Martha explained during one of their planning sessions, is recognizing that everyone involved has been affected by the same historical trauma. The criminal gang that operated in 1892 damaged multiple families, and Samuel Whitlow's death prevented proper healing of those wounds. Clara had arranged for a formal meeting at the town hall, inviting all parties with potential claims to the recovered stolen property. The agenda was ambitious: present complete documentation of Samuel Whitlow's investigation, establish the legitimate claims of affected parties, and develop a fair distribution plan that honored both legal rights and moral obligations. On the appointed day, the town hall filled with more people than Clara had expected. Tom Brennan and his extended family occupied 2 full rows of seats. Jake Morrison sat with representatives from Pacific Mutual Insurance Company who'd driven up from Denver to participate in the discussions. Martha had invited historians from the state university and legal experts familiar with territorial jurisdiction issues, but it was the presence of Helena residents that surprised Clara most. Jake's insurance company research had identified descendants of the original bank robbery victims, and several families had made the journey to Pine Ridge to participate in what they saw as a historic opportunity for closure. Clara stood at the front of the room with the original bank deposit ledger. She'd found among her grandfather's papers the final piece of evidence that proved the Brennan family's legitimate claims to specific items recovered from the criminal enterprise. Before we begin discussing distribution of the recovered property, Clara said, I want everyone to understand why we're here. This isn't about dividing up a treasure. This is about completing an investigation that Samuel Whitlow died trying to finish, returning stolen property to its rightful owners, and healing wounds that have affected multiple families for over 130 years. She opened the bank ledger, its pages yellow with age, but still clearly readable. This document records the specific items that were stolen from various victims in 1892. It shows that the Brennan family's mining equipment and accumulated gold dust were taken during the robbery of their mountain camp, just as their family stories have maintained for generations. Tom Brennan's voice was thick with emotion when he responded. You mean we were right about being robbed, but wrong about who was responsible? Exactly, Clara confirmed. Samuel Whitlow recovered your family's property along with everything else that was stolen. He was killed before he could return it to you. For over 130 years, your family has blamed the victim instead of the criminals. Jake Morrison stepped forward to present his company's position. Pacific Mutual Insurance paid out claims totaling $847,000 in 1892 currency for losses from the Helena bank robbery and related crimes. Under territorial and state law, recovery of stolen property covered by those claims creates subrogation rights that belong to the insurance company. A murmur of concern rippled through the audience. Clara had expected this moment, the point where corporate legal claims might override moral obligations to individual families. But Jake surprised everyone by continuing, however, our company also recognizes that strict enforcement of legal technicalities might not serve justice in this case. We're prepared to negotiate a settlement that acknowledges both our legal rights and the legitimate claims of robbery victims who were never properly compensated. Margaret Brennan, Tom's elderly aunt, stood slowly and addressed the room in a voice strengthened by 9 decades of mountain living. "I've carried anger about this situation my entire life," she said. "My grandfather died believing he'd been cheated by Samuel Whitlow. If we can finally set the record straight and honor both men's memories properly, that matters more to our family than any amount of money." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what Margaret Brennan was suggesting. The oldest living link to the 1892 events was choosing reconciliation over financial gain, healing over grudges that had poisoned family relationships for generations. Tom Brennan nodded in agreement with his aunt's sentiment. "Our family has prospered over the years, despite the losses we suffered in 1892. If there's a way to resolve this situation that honors Samuel Whitlow's sacrifice and provides fair compensation to all affected parties, that's what we want to support." Clara looked around the room at the faces of people who'd come together to resolve a historical injustice, and realized that her grandfather's true gift hadn't been the treasure itself. It had been the opportunity to bring truth to light and allow a community to heal wounds that had festered for more than a century. The negotiation process that followed required 3 more community meetings and consultation with legal experts from both Montana and Colorado. But Clara was amazed at how quickly goodwill replaced generations of mistrust. Once the truth about Samuel Whitlow's investigation became clear, Jake Morrison's insurance company proved surprisingly flexible in their approach to resolving the historical claims. The corporate representatives who'd traveled from Denver seemed genuinely moved by the community's commitment to historical justice rather than pure financial gain. "This case represents an opportunity for our company to demonstrate that corporate responsibility extends beyond profit margins," explained Sarah Chen, Pacific Mutual's regional director. "We're prepared to structure a settlement that acknowledges everyone's legitimate interests while honoring the historical significance of what Samuel Whitlow was trying to accomplish." The solution they developed was more creative than Clara had imagined possible. Rather than simply dividing the recovered gold among claimants, the group decided to create a community foundation that would use the treasure's value to benefit Pine Ridge and the broader region in ways that honored both Samuel Whitlow's sacrifice and the victims of the 1892 crimes. Tom Brennan would serve as the foundation's first chairman, finally receiving the recognition his family deserved for their losses, while taking responsibility for ensuring the recovered wealth benefited the entire community. Pacific Mutual Insurance agreed to waive most of their subrogation claims in exchange for a charitable tax deduction and positive publicity for their handling of the historical case. The descendants of Helena bank robbery victims would receive direct compensation for documented losses, funded by a portion of the cash's value. But more importantly, they'd finally have official recognition that their ancestors had been victims of crimes rather than failed business people. Clara's role in the settlement surprised her with its emotional significance. The Brennan family insisted that she receive a substantial finder's fee for her discovery and research. But they also offered her something more valuable, a new deed to the cottage and surrounding property, given freely as recognition of her integrity in bringing the truth to light. "Your great-great-grandfather died trying to return our stolen property," Tom Brennan explained as he presented the deed at the final community meeting. "The least we can do is ensure his descendant has a permanent home in the valley he chose to protect." But it was Jake Morrison who provided Clara with the opportunity that would reshape her future. "My company needs someone with your research skills and moral compass to handle historical insurance cases," he said, after the formal agreements were signed. "You've demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and community connection that makes complex investigations successful." Clara looked around the town hall at the faces of people who'd become her community. Martha Hendricks beaming with pride at the historical research they'd accomplished together, the Brennan family finally at peace with their family story. And even Jake Morrison transformed from suspicious investigator to genuine ally in the pursuit of justice. "I think I'd like that," Clara said, realizing she was committing not just to a job, but to a life rooted in the mountains and community her grandfather had loved. "But I have one condition. I work from Pine Ridge, and Rusty comes to the office with me." The laughter that filled the town hall felt like celebration of more than just successful negotiations. Clara realized she was witnessing the birth of new relationships built on truth rather than suspicion, cooperation rather than competition. As the formal meeting concluded and people gathered in smaller groups to discuss implementation details, Clara found herself standing with Martha near the front of the hall, looking at Samuel Whitlow's sheriff's badge displayed in a place of honor beside the historical documents that had revealed the truth about 1892. "Your grandfather would be proud," Martha said softly. "Not just of the treasure you found, but of the way you chose to handle it. William always believed that the real wealth in this valley came from neighbors taking care of each other." Clara touched the badge gently, feeling connected not just to Samuel Whitlow's sacrifice, but to the community that had preserved his story and given her the opportunity to complete his mission. The treasure hunt that had begun with Rusty's scratching at loose floorboards had become something far more valuable, a journey toward understanding her place in a story much larger than her own immediate needs. Outside the town hall, Rusty waited patiently in Clara's truck, the cat's new collar bearing Clara's name as a symbol of their permanent partnership. As Clara drove back to the cottage that was now truly her home, she reflected on how losing everything in Denver had led her to find treasures she'd never known she was missing: community, purpose, and the peace that comes from doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. The mountains rose around them in the gathering dusk, and Clara realized she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Clara stood on the restored porch of her cottage, watching the autumn sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of the treasure that had brought her home. The cottage bore little resemblance to the weathered structure she'd inherited. New shingles gleamed silver-gray in the evening light, windows sparkled with genuine glass, and the wraparound porch sat level and solid on its foundation. But the most significant changes weren't visible in the building's restoration. Clara had transformed from a lost city dweller into a valued member of the Pine Ridge community, her work with Jake Morrison's historical insurance investigations earning respect throughout the valley. Her kitchen table, once cluttered with mysterious maps and family documents, now served as her office, where she researched complex cases involving historical claims and forgotten property rights. Rusty supervised her work from his favorite spot on the windowsill, the orange tabby now sporting a new collar that bore both Clara's name and a small brass nameplate, identifying him as Research Assistant Whitlow Investigations. The cat had proven remarkably gifted at sensing when Clara was on the right track with difficult cases, his purring or restless behavior serving as a reliable indicator of whether her research was heading towards significant discoveries. The cottage had become a gathering place for community activities in ways Clara's grandfather had never experienced during his more solitary years. Martha Hendricks visited regularly, sharing historical research projects and helping Clara organize the family documents that had become an important resource for regional genealogical studies. Tom Brennan and his family had become close friends, their relationship healing from generations of misunderstanding to something approaching the partnership their ancestors should have enjoyed. In the 1890s, the Samuel Whitlow Community Foundation had exceeded everyone's expectations in its first year of operation. Funded by the treasure Clara had discovered and managed by a board that included representatives from all affected families, the foundation had provided college scholarships for local students, funded infrastructure improvements throughout Pine Ridge, and established a historical research center that attracted visitors from across the region, but perhaps most importantly, the foundation had commissioned a proper memorial to Samuel Whitlow, installed in the town square where his sacrifice as a territorial deputy sheriff could be remembered and honored. The memorial included his actual badge, displayed behind protective glass, along with a detailed account of his investigation into the 1892 criminal enterprise and his death in the line of duty. Clara visited the memorial regularly, often accompanied by Rusty and sometimes by other community members who'd been touched by the story of historical justice finally achieved. The inscription read simply, Samuel Whitlow, 1847-1892, Territorial Deputy Sheriff. Died serving his community and protecting his neighbors. His mission, completed by his great-great-granddaughter Clara Whitlow, 2025. On this particular evening, Clara was expecting visitors. Jake Morrison and his wife Sarah were coming for dinner. Part of a monthly tradition that had developed as their professional partnership had grown into genuine friendship. Jake had proven to be not just an excellent business partner, but a valuable connection to the broader world of historical investigation, bringing Clara cases that took her throughout the Mountain West, while always allowing her to return to the cottage that had become her anchor as Clara prepared dinner on the wood stove that had served multiple generations of her family. She reflected on the changes that had transformed her life. The marketing career that had seemed so important in Denver now felt like preparation for work that actually mattered, using research skills and analytical thinking to resolve historical injustices and help families understand their heritage. The financial security provided by her work with Jake and the finder's fee from the treasure discovery meant Clara never again had to worry about basic necessities. But more importantly, she'd found the sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from her urban life. Every case she worked on connected her more deeply to the history and culture of the Mountain West, and every successful resolution strengthened her ties to the community that had accepted her as one of their own. Rusty jumped down from his windowsill perch and padded to the front door, his behavior indicating that their guests were approaching even before Clara could hear Jake's truck coming up the mountain road. The cat had developed an impressive ability to recognize the vehicles and footsteps of frequent visitors, serving as an early warning system that never failed to amuse Jake and Sarah. As Clara opened the door to welcome her friends, she felt a surge of gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought her to this moment. Losing her job and her fiancé in Denver had felt like personal catastrophe at the time. But those losses had led her to discoveries she never could have imagined. Family history, community connection, meaningful work, and the deep satisfaction that comes from completing something important that had been left unfinished. Something smells wonderful, Sarah said as she and Jake settled into chairs around Clara's kitchen table, the same table where she'd first studied her grandfather's hidden maps and documents. And Rusty looks like he's put on weight since we saw him last month, Clara laughed, scratching behind the cat's ears as he purred with satisfaction. He's been getting extra treats from Martha every time she visits. She claims he helps with her research by indicating which documents are most important. But I think she just likes spoiling him. As they shared dinner and conversation about their current cases and community news, Clara realized she'd found something far more valuable than Samuel Whitlow's recovered gold. She'd found her place in the world, surrounded by people who valued integrity, community, and the patient work of making things right. Outside the cottage windows, the mountains stood eternal and protective, their peaks catching the last light of evening as they'd done for centuries before Samuel Whitlow first climbed these trails and would continue doing long after Clara's own story was complete. But for now, in this moment, she was exactly where she belonged, home at last, with Rusty beside her and a future filled with mysteries yet to be solved and injustices yet to be healed. The treasure hunt that had begun with a cat's insistent scratching had led Clara to the greatest treasure of all, a life lived in service to truth, community, and the healing of old wounds. And as she looked around her restored cottage at the faces of friends who'd become family, Clara knew that some discoveries are worth more than gold.